Hello, friends. This is the Parables of Grief podcast, and this is your host, Mama Bear Wendy. I'm here to share some love and light with you on your journey through grief and loss. I hope as our healing paths connect for the next few minutes, we can walk together and find strength for the road ahead. One scientist suggests that what the grieving need most is to have others witness our pain and help us not feel so alone. I hope in our time together you will find the companionship and understanding that you need. The intention of this podcast is to use parables of grief to find the Savior and His promised healing in the daily and commonplace, to see how we are truly never alone, and to find, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, the Savior by our side, even if we didn't recognize Him at first because He showed up in unexpected and common ways. Also, there is much coming soon to help with your journey. The Parables of Grief book will be coming out by Christmas of 2025, and there are opportunities to join me in online grief groups and one-on-one companion sessions. Please check out my website at mamabearwendy.com for more information. Today's story is about a fiery furnace, and maybe in your grief and loss, like me, you have felt like it's been a fiery furnace. So today we're going to start out with a quote. We're going to have several stories, one from the Old Testament in Daniel 3, and two from my personal experience. And then we're going to talk about what we've learned. And then we're going to have our moral for the story today, and that is, even if not, God is still good. So first we're going to start out with our quote. And the quote is from Elder Neil L. Anderson in the Triumph of Hope of October 2024 conference. As we strengthen our faith in Jesus Christ, we see beyond our struggles to the blessings and promises of eternity. And like I said, we're going to start out with a story from Daniel 3, which is a story about a fiery furnace. In this story, there are three heroes, and they have fun names to say: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men were rulers under King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was the king that had conquered the Jews and taken them back to his country. So these are captive people that have been removed, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are over the Jews. And when we hear this story, if you've heard it before, then you already are thinking about the miracle that took place. And hindsight is 2020, so we know the ending, but I want you to be thinking about them, and like you, they don't know the ending. So their faith is real. Their faith and trust in the Lord is very different than what we think on this side of the story. So King Nebuchadnezzar builds a big statue out of gold and tells all the people in his kingdom that they have to worship it every time that this music plays. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to do so. And they are brought before the king for their rebellion and their dissent from obeying. And he tells them that the consequence for their disobedience is that they will be cast into a fiery furnace and killed. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do not waver in their refusal to worship any god but their own. And they say to the king, "If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thy hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Now, of course, King Nebuchadnezzar has been disobeyed, and of course he is very angry. So he not only has them thrown in the fire, but he has the fire turned up to 7 times hotter than it normally is. And he has his most mighty men take Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, and they are wearing protective clothing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are bound and taken into the fire. And the men, because the heat of the fire is so much hotter, are killed. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not. And the king notices that there are 4 men in the fire, even though only 3 men were taken in. And he says, his eyes being opened, that one of them is like the Son of God. And he calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come out. And not only are they not burned and killed, but their clothes don't smell like fire and their hair is not singed. And they're protected so fully that there is no evidence that they were in the fire. This is a mighty miracle and a beautiful story, and I love hearing it. But I think the question that we can ask ourselves is, what if our miracle doesn't look like we thought it would? And what if we are put into the fiery furnace of grief and loss? So then that makes me think of one of my favorite hymns, and that hymn is How Firm a Foundation. And in How Firm a Foundation, it says, I'm going to actually read to you verses 5, 6, and 7. When through fiery trials thy pathway shall lie, my grace all sufficient shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee, I only design thy dross to consume and thy gold to refine. Even down to old age, all my people shall prove my sovereign, eternal, unchangeable love. And then when gray hair shall their temples adorn, like lambs shall they still in my bosom be born. That soul that on Jesus hath leaned for repose, I will not, I cannot desert to his foes. That soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never, I'll never, no never, I'll never, no never, no never forsake. So my 2 stories and experiences with this fiery furnace certainly is a figurative and not true, but my experience was when I first saw my husband after he had been killed. Because of the nature of the circumstances surrounding his death, he was taken to the medical examiners instead of to a hospital or somewhere because he died at the scene. And so I was unable to see him for 2 days. And as a grieving wife, I was very distressed by this. I had been told by medical professionals and the officer at the scene that my husband was dead. But of course, not having seen him, I was still very much in a blessed place of denial that he was alive and it was all a big mistake. So the first time I saw him was at the mortuary, and I was anxious. I was in a hurry. I really wanted to see him just to prove, perhaps, that it was all a big mistake. And so when we asked the mortuary person if we could see him, my 2 sons were with me, my oldest and my 4th son, and he said, yes, you can see him, but he's pretty rough. And not knowing what that meant or anything about it, I relied on my medical training and experience that I had seen dead bodies. And so I wasn't sure what rough meant, but I assumed that I was prepared to see my husband. I was not. Probably no one is ready to see their loved one dead, but the person at the mortuary was correct. He was rough, which meant that he was green and he was very cold and very dead. And he had been embalmed, so he was very hard as well, and like wax. It was a very miserable thing. And it was like a big train of reality went right through the middle of me. And I was so overwhelmed and so overcome by the anguish of it that I tipped over onto chairs behind me. I didn't pass out because I was still awake, but I could not stand up under the anguish and agony of it. And my son had to yell at me, "Mom, breathe. Mom, breathe." I was not breathing, and I didn't want to. It was so heavy and so hard to bear. That was the first experience that I had of being carried and strengthened. And I felt that ministering angels, including my sweetheart, were there with me to help me carry that. I did feel the Savior hold me together and help me to bear the burden and the fire that happened. The second time that I felt very strongly was about a week after my husband died. I went to the temple with a friend and did sealings. And in that place of beauty and light, I felt angels come and I felt them sew me back together. As I said, when I saw my husband's body, it felt as though a train of reality had gone through the middle of me and I was split open and bleeding and just a mess, like a donut, like I had this big missing piece out of the middle of me. And I felt angels sew me back together. I felt ministering and the Savior putting healing on me, that it was not so raw and bleeding and poisoned even. So I testify that I was not forsaken. I was not abandoned in my fire. I think there are several things that I learned, and I think maybe they are best addressed by questions. And the first question is, how can we accept the suffering and loss with patience and faith rather than anger and rebellion? And how can we know that God is still good, even when what happened is so not good? And how can we see the Savior in our fiery furnace with us, even when our miracle didn't come? These are all questions that I think we can find answers to only as we choose faith. As long as we choose that anger and rebellion and choose that natural man that is an enemy to God and embrace our Savior as the only hope that we have, as we turn to Him in our suffering instead of turning away from Him in our suffering, we find that He is there and He is willing and He is able to heal us. I think what I've learned is that it is a choice, and the choice is to choose the Savior, even when we have fear and we have doubt and we have pain, that He can succor us in a way that is unique to Him and a blessing. And I hope that this message, God is still good, even if not, even if our miracle did not happen the way we had hoped, and even if we were thrown into the fire, that the Savior will not leave us alone. He cannot forsake us, and He will run to us. Succor means to run to, and I testify that He will run to you in your pain. If you would like more grief support, please see my website at mamabearwendy.com for my upcoming 5 Pillars of Resilience group and one-on-one opportunities. Although your experience and path will be unique, there is hope ahead in this path, and you are not alone. I can see your pain, and we will walk this road together. Let's take a deep breath together. And here is a big bear hug from Mama Bear Wendy. Until next time.